A warm welcome to everyone who is joining us. Welcome from your different time zones today. My name is Nondumiso Simanga, and I am the research coordinator for VIAD's Radical Others, and this is a Radical Digitalities program. Hashtag Black Box is a discursive and artistic space that refuses simplistic narratives of technological progress and instead embraces what we call the queer frictions, playful ambiguities, radical inventions, and emergences that happen when Black liberatory art making meets digitality. For brief background on the concept of hashtag Black Box, while it does revel in the connections to digital black boxes and the secrets or generative mysteries and messages therein, hashtag Black Box is a discursive site following the thinking of curator Okwui Enwezor. And in his seminal essay, The Black Box 2002, curator Okwui Enwezor described a world in transformation, a world where curatorial practice exists as a discursive potential to disrupt dominant Western art historical narratives. Enwezor argued that the black box, in contrast to the white cube of traditional exhibition spaces, holds within it surplus meaning, ambiguity, and the capacity for radical imagination and radical reimagination of power. And so today we will be touching on some of those things as we speak with our two critical artists who are thinkers on the interfaces of Black digital art, African and Afrodiasporic ways of knowing. And we are incredibly honored to have our inimitable speakers, Russel Hlongwane and Nolan Oswald Dennis. And Abdul says, aware, I believe. I am going to introduce our speakers very briefly. All right, our discussion today is labeled Tech Futures and Poetics in Black Digital Arts. And we're going to be speaking with Russel Hlongwane, who is a cultural producer based in Durban, South Africa. His work is located at the intersection of heritage, modernity, and culture or tradition as it applies to Black life. His practice includes artistic research, creative producing, design curatorship, and the creative economy. Hlongwane is part of several collectives, working groups, and programs spread across the SADC region, the continent, and internationally. He's curated exhibitions, art platforms, locally and abroad, one of which he curated and invited Nolan Oswald Dennis, apparently. And Russel Hlongwane's artistic work has shown extensively across Europe and Africa, whilst to a lesser degree across parts of East Asia, the United States, and Latin America, which should be an interesting conversation around digital spaces in those areas as well. Russel Hlongwane is a winner of numerous awards. He has received the Jury Prize in 2019 for his experimental film, Ifu Elimnyama, The Dark Cloud, which we will be seeing today, and many other awards. I will skip ahead to DATA, the Institute of Technological Consciousness, is one of Russel Hlongwane's latest filmic works in collaboration with Knutzer and Wilson. And he, Russel Hlongwane, has published through academic and art journals on design, artistic practice, technopolitics, and urban studies. He also works as a consultant with cultural institutions and government departments concerned with providing meaningful support to creative ecologies. And as part of this interest, he serves on boards of many organizations in the sector, including Prince Claus International Advisory Committee. And we also have Nolan Oswald Dennis, with a BA in architecture from the University of the Witwatersrand, a science MA in art, culture, and technology from Massachusetts Institute of Technology at Cambridge, Massachusetts. Nolan Oswald Dennis is an internationally acclaimed interdisciplinary artist who explores a Black consciousness of space, the material and metaphysical conditions of decolonization, and space itself should be an interesting part of our conversation today with Nolan. The artist's work questions the politics of space through a system-specific approach, They are concerned with the hidden structures that condition social and political imagination. Through diagrams, drawings, and models, Dennis is interested in systems that transverse multiple realms and explores a coded landscape of systematic and structural conditions of world organization. Dennis has exhibited at the 9th Berlin Biennale, the Young Congo Biennale, and many, many other highly prestigious galleries and museums worldwide. The artist's work has shown on the Symbio Art and Art Interacting at the Critical Node between Biotechnology and Contemporary Art exhibition at the Fada Gallery presented by VIAD Research Center. And Nolan Oswald Dennis has been a VIAD Research Center associate since 2018. With that mouthful of incredible biographical information from both of you, we're going to begin officially our program with hearing from Russel Hlongwane, who is going to present an opening, an offering, an introduction of sorts into his work through Ifu Elimnyama.
Thank you very much, Nondumiso. Thank you to Viad. Great to be in conversation, Nolan. And thanks to everyone who's taken their precious time to be with us this evening. What I will share is around 5 minutes or so, and it's a way for you to enter the broader universe of the film and some of the pursuits that the film is trying to reach. So I'll be reading, or else I will go off topic and I'll ramble. Yeah. So I'll be looking into the screen quite intently. So it goes, the invitation to be in conversation today is predicated on this film, Ifo Elimnyama, which roughly translates to dark cloud in the English. The film attempts to imagine a mode of thinking about a few questions, which are the question of technology from a Nguni perspective, to valorize the deep and rich folkloric tradition of the region of present-day KwaZulu-Natal, and to ask what other aesthetical registers might we turn to in order to account for the long durée of the Nguni transcendentalists beyond the tropes of Afrofuturism and dislodging of the perception that technology or science fiction does not have an African past. Extending out of the film is a performance lecture which sees me as the director and the writer of the film in dialogue with the life of Malanje, who is a protagonist in the film. Malanje is imagined as an ancestor who had led a group of scientists who had led a group of scientists in the early 1900s. He had led them up a local mountain to sample spring water. And the said mountain in Danyana is said to be associated with the peculiar cloud phenomena around it. And the said mountain was said to be associated with the peculiar cloud phenomena, which in turn is due to a cryptid serpent called Inganyamba. None of these men returned from this perilous journey up the mountain. Shortly after Malange's disappearance, I suffered a series of lucid dreams where the man had returned to visit in the dream states and to narrate the conditions of his disappearance. This series of lucid dreams occurred against the backdrop of a futile master's project in the anthropology department. And what Malanje had returned to do was, through the narration of his disappearance, in essentially leading me to some of the answers that the research was trying to do. And so what Malanje does in this way, and as well as in the film, is to connect a number of points that I've listed before. And if I maybe add one more, is to also think about how one positions technological thinking, technological practice, with the spiritual realm, the ancestral realm, transcendent kind of modes of transcendence, and kind of thinking of a method to aestheticize and think critically about these questions. So hopefully, kind of this is good enough for you to get a sense of what the film is trying to do, and the other elements that exist alongside in support of the film, and then we can go into the deeper kind of questions around this, and I'm happy to unpack that. For now, I think I'll hold it here and hand over the mic back to you, Nondumiso.
Thank you, Russell. We're going to switch over to Nolan's opening, and then we'll look at the works relative to one another and have a conversation about those together. Nolan, you may.
Um, One of the things that I've been trying to think about in preparation for this conversation are what um, I think the question for me is, what do we mean when we say digitality? Like, what are we referring to? Because the scope of the digital is vast and deep and shallow and superficial and meaningful. And also, I think maybe more importantly, what are we thinking about Blackness in relation to this space? I don't have answers for that, but I think that's kind of one of the questions I'll put into the room. Um, but I think for me, when I think about digitality, it's kind of inseparable from sociality. And there are multiple ways to think about this. Um, my kind of tendency is to think about it in relation to tools, and somehow the digital both as like a affect, but also as like a kind of mode of information processing, experience rendering, all of this kind of stuff. It kind of joins an existing community of tools, I would say. And I think this is what I wanted to kind of think through in relation to Russell's work, that digital tools are not some kind of radical departure from a history of mediation that has always been there, a history of tools that extend our capacities beyond the boundary of our bodies. So like yeah, computational tools are akin to narrative tools, are akin to industrial tools. These are all part of like this kind of long history of human extension, like moving ourselves beyond ourselves. And I think the part of this history, which is, you know, the history of tools, which is related to the history of labor, is inconceivable without the racialized history of the body, the racialized history of labor, and especially the racialized history of tools. And I think this is kind of like the thing that I've been trying to think about, both as a kind of critique of the digital, to understand that like digital tools suffer from the same kind of historical pitfalls as all other tools, which is to say they are always operate in relation to power, and power as we have come to know it in the last 500 years is always and suddenly increasingly like returning to a kind of racial expression of privilege, racial expression of power. This is going not where I wanted it to go, but this is the problem with history. But I think, yeah, I wanted to think about this racialized body and this racialized machine or racialized digital space in relation to the problem of tools, and the ambiguity of tools. And the problem of tools, I think I guess you'd have to say something like blackness and black bodies are deeply entangled in the problems of tools precisely because African people have been rendered as a kind of extension of capital and an extension of industrial processes, basically as tools, the enslaved body as a tool. Um, and and so something like Audre Lorde's constant reminder that the master's tools um, will not dismantle the master's house feels like something that is always necessary to grapple with when thinking about working with a tool or thinking about working with any kind of like mediation device, any kind of technological device. But there's also the ambiguity of tools, that it's not necessarily clear at any point what a tool is for. And I think the history of, say, like radical thought and Black liberation practice has always been uh, deeply connected to the misuse or reimagination of tools. So this is kind of like the really broad uh, kind of thinking that I wanted to do in relation to your work and in relation to the digital itself. And one of the things I want to kind of prompt us to think about is something we might want to think about as like the registers of digitality. I have it written down here somewhere, maybe I can find it. But yeah, maybe I won't find it. But I think we can talk about digital space as kind of social space in a banal sense, in the sense that like Facebook, Instagram, like the whole meta complex, or Twitter/X, these are like the social spaces of digitality. That's one register. Maybe WhatsApp or the precursors, Mixit, another kind of register, like a slightly more private or interpersonal, less like public in that way. But then there's also what we might think about as like the back end of digital space, which is also a kind of social space. How applications are produced, how code is written, how code is shared. Like there's a kind of social space around the production of digital applications that is also kind of interesting to think about. And I think as I'm trying to think about Blackness and digitality, I'm not only interested in Blackness and digitality from the perspective of being a user of digital technology, but also very much interested in the economy and kind of like conceptual community of African and Black technologists, programmers, developers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think I'm going to kind of stop there because I think, yeah, if we can defeat the demons and play the video, it'll be really nice.
Yeah,
Yeah, and we can.
great. And before we try to go ahead with um, trying to wake up what is asleep, I would like to invite Russell to respond.
Cool. And I think excuse me, I think it's beautiful, this tangent that Nolan has taken us to, because we had said this, that our projects are interested in the same questions, but they kind of veer off in very different directions. And I think what you've done here, Nondumiso, which is to balance these two modes of making and these two modes of making, and I think a similar mode of thinking, I would say, allows us to build texture and to expand the horizons of how digitality has been rendered and how it's kind of what the dominant discourse around this says, you know. So a case in point is our obsession and fascination with Mapungubwe as a site. In my own thinking, if one is engaged in the inquiry and the questions of innovation, questions of say scientific making or scientific thinking perhaps, and and kind of object making as an extension, say technological objects and gadgets, the fertile field of Mapungubwe is one place to go, you know. But I kind of I come out of that, I'll come out of that site with the set of say renders or renderings, which are very different to what Nolan comes out with, you know. And I think somewhere in that expansion of the present Mapungubwe is a in a way it's a kind of it's a response to history. Yeah. It's taking stock and accounting for and building the evidence, or perhaps speculating upon the evidence of the things that haven't surfaced. Say, you know, we've you know, people have excavated and they've arrived at the set of objects that kind of have built this curiosity and the interest in Mapungubwe. But if we can agree that those objects were outputs of the people from Mapungubwe, what have we not, what didn't make it to the surface? Yeah, what remains buried underneath? Not just the soil of Mapungubwe, but the soil across the continent, you know? And can one use this mode of speculation, you know, to make the case that there has been a long culture of producing with or producing tools, producing objects and artifacts, and what lives behind that production, you know, the imagination that makes those tools, the kind of the social dimension or the social life that requires and is necessary for those tools to come out of Mapungubwe, you know? And so when Nolan talks about this kind of the sociality of digitality, for me, it's kind of to think at these multiple scales and ways, you know?
Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
very much. And I'd like to pick up on that between the two of you, something quite interesting in terms of thinking about the site of Mapungubwe as a discursive site, as a site that also encourages us to think about tools and the application thereof as the definition of technology, really. And to then be able to think about the space of digital technologies as a useful place to explore the ways in which the application of those tools can create a different kind of social dimension for people who are in the here, in the future, in the past, and how we then are thinking about these kind of poetics of Black digital arts and the ways in which you in your work, Russell, and you in your work, Nolan, are working with the tools of language, with the poetics of the digital as well, right? The kind of poetry that emerges from using the tools of digital technology to be able to work with a very particular kind of Black liberation thinking. And so it's quite interesting to come back to you, Nolan, and to ask you about the site of Mapungubwe, the site of the African continent, and the kind of poetics that emerge when you are working with Black liberation thought. And in this a quite general open format before we get into the works themselves. Could you tell us a little bit about that and the kind of ways that your provocation to us today, what you want us to think about, really holds some of that ground of how you make?
Um, yeah, big question, but I mean, I really love to think and talk about Mapungubwe. And
Mm.
so this is a great opportunity for me. Um, I think my approach, both as like a kind of provocation to myself, but also as a kind of a conceptual commitment, is to try to avoid thinking about sites and rather think about systems. And so I've been thinking about Mapungubwe as a system and how to, um, in a way, like intuit um, this system to determine what its boundaries are, to figure out what its function is. And obviously, maybe not so obvious, but it's easy to assume or necessary to assume that Mapungubwe is multiple systems. And the first one that you meet when you go to the site is this kind of archaeological tourist conjunction. But there's a kind of an undersystem that I've been thinking about. And all I'll say to try to like bring us together is part of the system of Mapungubwe is the production and the function or I don't know if function is the right word, but the production and the use of secrets.
Mm.
And I think this is something very useful to think about in relation to digitality as well, which is constantly a game, maybe a very serious game of transparency and opacity, of exposure and maybe encryption is the digital word to use, you know. And this is all going everywhere, but I think the thing about Mapungubwe, which is nice to think about, is what has been revealed and what has been hidden, and also what hiding as a kind of practice preserved. There's a kind of, and I guess what I'm trying to say is that um, well, maybe not thousands of years, for like 900 years, perhaps, Mapungubwe was a protected site and it had a set of protocols around how you access that site. It was a known site. You know, people knew that it was there, but it was protected. There were all these practices up until very recently. Even this family that were the first grave robbers of Mapungubwe write about these protocols of access. And what these protocols of access preserved the site. We think of archaeology as a kind of preservation mechanism, but archaeology, at least in this case, is the beginning of the degradation of the site, the humiliation of the site, the destruction of the site. But before that, there was a practice of real preservation. And that practice was really deeply intertwined with the secret. And the secret was both keeping the site a secret, but a secret that, in a way, everybody knew, but also not violating the boundaries of the site to reveal the secret. So the knowledge of Mapungubwe has always been much more important than verifying the knowledge through digging up the graves and revealing the bodies and blah, 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 blah. So this is
So,
kind of
yeah,
yeah, I mean,
yeah, yeah.
that's something.
I'll hold it there. I want to hold on to this idea of the of Mapungubwe as a system, and a system that mobilizes the tool of secrecy in its knowledge preservation and its knowledge perhaps sharing. And I think it's quite useful to think of that in relation to the black box, which particularly is a box which holds digital knowledge and is also highly protected, and there are very particular kind of protocols to be able to access that kind of knowledge. And even with access to that knowledge, one is not always able to decipher what that knowledge actually means.
Sengihambe amakhulu ezinkulungwane nezigidi zamalanga emkhathini. Phakathi kwemihlaba ngidlula odalagwini lezinkanyezi amagumbini amaningi omkhathi angajwayelekile. Ngiphuma kwelemimoya ephansi kwempucuzeko yezinga eliphezulu kakhulu kwelemincwi eyafudukela esigabeni sesine la emkhathini. Ngibuyelela emhlabeni woyise nonina bezizukulwane sabansundu ukuzofakaza ngenkululeko yenkanyamba eyabithenwe amandla unomphelo ocishe beyingunaphakade. Yaduka endleleni yayo emva kokuthi umkhombandlela wayo udukelene nomkhondo ngomoya eyabe iwulandela yamanse emthumeni phakathi kwesibhakabhaka nomkhathi. Emva kokushabalala kolwazi lwempucuzeko yabansundu efinela lithukuzile ligcine yonke lemqingo, yabe izikhwabaniseka. Okulandela lapho eside isimo sesomiso esadlula ezinye empilweni yemlando yempilo yake yaqoshwa. Ifukazi leli azange sakwazi ukufukamela linethisa amanzi emvula noma ukuxhumanisa udlelwano ngomoya lutho nje ukunyakaza okwenza kunciphe amathemba kwabaphila ngaphansi kwalo ifu leli. Thola ukuthi phakathi nendawo kwale mpica badala inkinankina kwabe kucashe obala umhwebi ogama lakhe linguQhomqayise. Umndeni ayezalwa kuwo kungowasebukhosini obukhulu okwakuyiwo kanye owabe uphathiswe amandla okugcina izihluthulelo zalo lonke ulwazi lwentuthuko ngempucuzeko eyabe kufanelwe iphilwe. Kwagcina kutholakele ukuthi usezakhele umcebo namandla ngenxanye ngokukhwabanisa ulwazi aselwebile kuyifukazi leli maqede alixheshe kumaseva. Amaseva ndini lawa ayewakhiqiza yena ezimbonini zohwebo. impilo nokufezeka ngezenzo ephuma kweliphambili emkhathini wesigaba sesine ezikweni lolwazi ngobungoti bokuhlambulula amafu yona nje idinga ukuxhumana nesigodlo esikhulu sakwamaphungubwe nayo yonke ingabadikazi yohlanga olwempisholo.
So I'd like to pick up from what we were floating around with earlier, and to come into this idea of the poetics of this kind of work, of your work, of Ifwele Russel. And I want to pick up on something that Nolan, I believe, said in our previous conversation, which was that we don't have a language to describe our relationship to technology. And this idea of language, particularly, and how the digital then meets the social. Russel, your work in locating itself from an African language to be able to speak through and to and about digital technologies is very useful in this way. Can you speak a little bit to your use of language, your use of translation, your investigation into the kind of words that we can use? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the process of making film is a very kind of communal process, you know. And in this film in particular, we were trying to we'd started a glossary of terms in isiZulu that that we could utilize in as everyday isiZulu kind of, you know, conversations that starts to accurately describe or refer to technological processes and objects. So one that I might use as an example is umkhombandlela. Umkhombandlela is what we used in this film to speak about the GPS. So ukhomba, quite literally, is to point, indlela is the way. And the idea was we could utilize these terms that exist in the isiZulu language and repurpose them just a bit. And they still serve the function, which is to say, one needn't explain to someone what a GPS is without, well, one can use this term umkhombandlela without trying to explain what a GPS is. Also, not to use, you know, often when someone refers to a technological object in isiZulu, you'd say like imoto, ifridge, you know. In this case, you're not trying to say GPS, umkhombandlela, and kind of people have an instance. And I think that does something to how we own and build proximity to the everyday kind of, you know, it's this way of claiming the language of technology does something to how we understand our relationship to technology. So technology not being a kind of an alien object, but something that has kind of been built, so something that we've contributed to. Another term would be uchungechunge, which was used to describe a network of networks, you know. And again, uchungechunge is a term that people use, like say, to talk about beadwork, for example. It's a process of weaving. And so uchungechunge in this case to mean the network, again, kind of it inserts itself into the very fabric, into the very core dump of technology. And I think this is a very important output of the work. So the film is not the point. The film is incidental. It's all the stuff that gets generated in the making of the film, which I think is the real work, you know, and it's contributing to this kind of reclamation and the ownership of technology at a
No,
holistic level.
yeah, I'd like to think about the the kind of surplus that you're creating, to use Okwui Enwezor's words, that the work itself becomes a discursive act, a discursive output, but that what is being created is an excess of knowledge. And you were also speaking to the need and the importance of the work creating proximity with digital technologies, particularly from an African geolocation, right? And I think it's quite important to also recognize that in terms of the future being positioned, being visualized as a hyper-technological world, that Africa is very much given a distant kind of spatial relation, and then our social relation to digitality then becomes quite removed, and we don't see ourselves as being future makers, part of this future. And so I want to ask you a little bit about that, about, I see your work in terms of poetics as a kind of decolonial, even anti-colonial kind of poetics, where you're producing knowledge to shift our relation to power, because digital language is such an important mode of creating power in our current and in our future. So I want to ask you a little bit about that, about how not just the research into language and the glossary, and I know that there's also a performance lecture around it, but the site of the digital, and I mean site here in the larger sense, right? The space of the
Yeah.
digital. Your work being available online and not
Yeah.
just the content being quite digital in its medium. Can you
Yeah.
speak a little bit to that and how that actually becomes important in creating that proximity, in creating that kind of socialization as well of Africa relative to digital technologies, relative to the future?
Fine. I mean, it's like it's so slippery to talk about these things. So this term, the dark cloud, ife elimnyama, it's a term that is understood, at least in isiZulu, like when someone says ife elimnyama, people know exactly what you're referring to, and it's the same connotation in the English, this dark cloud, something that predicts gloom, lives. But if you want to think about, say, the cloud, and one could like venture off to Nomkhubulwane, for example, as understood as the kind of the goddess of fertility within the Nguni cosmology, and you move from this kind of connection between this life-giving element, which is water or rain, and its association to the cloud, and kind of to bring in this figure of Nomkhubulwane, departs from that and go towards, say, cloud culture. Yeah. And sorry, and I should add on to this matrix of Nguni cosmology in Ganyamba, which is the scripted snake, which has been kind of it's very deeply embedded in the imagination of Amazulu, for example. So you move from kind of that matrix that one sits up there and kind of take this across to this context of cloud culture. And suddenly there's a way in which we can move between this kind of Western construction of the digital space, but we can speak to it utilizing the metaphors, the folklore, and the poetics, say, obviously Zulu, yeah? And so when you talk about building proximity and you talk about the sociality of it, language, the making of language is a social process, it's a system to utilize Nolan's point. And so suddenly to work between these terms and to stretch terms, to imbue existing terms with new meanings, and to bring new, to produce new terms for activities, for actions and tools that exist today, through isiZulu. Now imagine if someone undertakes the same work and does it for, say, Sesotho, for example, isiXhosa and isiNdebele. I think that that process of making, that process of producing the language does something to kind of be locked in that workshop, for example. There's something quite interesting there that, like, say, speaks to the social dimension. It also speaks to producing excess, I think, is that you used, you know. And for me, this is the work. This is the interest. And so between moving, also moving between languages allows us to translate, to mistranslate, and through those slippages, something really productive allows us to move beyond the kind of the delineations between Western thought and non-Western thoughts, you know, so that one doesn't work against the other. One utilizes the fruits of the other to fortify something that is much beyond the claim of a certain people to producing a particular kind of knowledge. And I think we begin to build a much more orchestral body of knowledge, one that's, you know, can speak to multiplicity. It's making
Yeah. And I think you're also, as you're speaking, you're reminding me of Achille Mbembe's lecture. I believe it was in 2018, or no, probably earlier. He gave a lecture during Fees Must Fall, and it was around decolonization, but he was speaking about future knowledges. And in that lecture, he was speaking to the very real imbrication of African ancestral knowledge with digital technologies. And so he also was arguing um, for how easy it is, in fact, to slip into speaking about African cosmologies and digital practices with the same language. And that means that Africa has access to the workings of digital technologies in ways that we should be able to not only be proximal to, but also really orchestrate in our own terms. And so I think there's something interesting about that as well, because your work isn't just about the kind of future technologies, which we really think about as this kind of techno agency where our capacity to buy into the future gives us agency. But your work really, I think, in this way that your poetics is decolonial, disrupts temporality. So it doesn't say that Africa is this past, this historical paradigm, but that even where Mapungubwe is a system, that all of these systems flow through time between past, present, and future in interesting ways. And so I'm curious about also then how you think about the access that is already available, the excess actually of the meanings of isiZulu terms to provide that kind of language that we need to find our proximity in this relationship with digital technology.
Can I give this one some thought, perhaps, and I'll try to come
Absolutely,
back to it. Yeah?
absolutely. Yes, because that's also, I think, a challenge, in terms of the work that you're continuing to do. So I'd like to come to Nolan next, and I'd like to, Nolan, just share briefly a video from A Sun Black so that people have some reference if they have not interacted with the work online. We can share all of the links to these works because they are freely available online, so that you can experience them yourself. And a sun dot black. A sun dot black is an essay game, and these are the instructions for how to play the game. You click a playable term. You read a passage aloud, do body. You listen. You read index aloud. Firmament. You listen. Repeat. You click firmament for guide. You track the progress via the Ubu body image carrier bag. To disentangle the carrier bag, click the Ubu button. You click do to hold screen. and you save to local disk. You click black to switch cosmograms. And then here you'll see that this was taken from, let me go forward a bit, pause. It was taken from Nkupuleng Molloy's conversation published in the Mail and Guardian with Nolan. And Nkupuleng Molloy also then lists that the game has 3 anatomical spaces, the landing, the grounding, and the passage. And Nolan says that you begin with Bambara variations, which are Tony Cade Bambara variations. And it repeats, is your house in order? Is their house in order? Is our house in order? Is my house in order? And before this goes to another work, I'd like to share an intro video to A Sun Dot Black. Nolan, A Sun Dot Black, it hits right on the nail of poetics, right? And really the game is also about creating one's own poem, but a poem that one can't claim as their own because it includes fragments of other people's writings coming into the work, and then the poem shifts as well as one plays. And so Nkupuleng Molloy called it a kind of distributed poetics. And I found that term also useful because of the ways that when you speak about digitality and its social orientation, that with these generative exercises, you are within a social paradigm. You're co-creating as you play the game and make a work of art. Can you speak a little bit to your interest in language, in these Black liberation theories and the poetics of this game?
Sure. I guess it's important to say that a big inspiration for this game is the writing of Dambudzo Marachera, and in particular this book called Black Sunlight. And I think Marachera, I mean, anyway, I'm not going to explain Marachera. Marachera is beyond explanation. But I think it's, for me, the use of language in Marichel's practice in general, but in this book in particular, is kind of radical. It's a kind of a fragmentation, explosion of language, that in a way like gestures towards a kind of visionary based consciousness rather than like a rules based consciousness. I don't know how to describe it, but it's this, and then this text by Tony Cade Bambara, which is called On the Issue of Roles. And it's about kind of her exploration and experiences with gender dynamics in Black radical politics. And one of the things she does in this, she talks about in this short essay, is a writing exercise where she'd ask young Black people to write, and then remove their names from the writing and redistribute it to the class, and try to, or yeah, in a way, try to do a kind of a transgender swap through the writing, and for young Black activists to understand their own kind of perceptive biases through how they read other people's work. And there's a lot to unpack there, but it really struck with me that she proposed a kind of a language game to deal with something that we need to deal with, you know? And for me, I think the idea of this as a internal dynamic rather than a kind of a Black liberation practice that's facing the kind of oppressive external. This was a practice that was about ourselves. So this is kind of where the game emerges from.
Mm.
Um,
And can
and
I touch on that interior space that becomes possible when one is interacting with digital work, which can happen in a one-on-one kind of dynamic where you are alone, but within a different kind of sociality, differently to being inside of a gallery or experiencing something in a theater where you are together with other people, even if you are together alone. Yeah, can you speak to something about the usefulness of this kind of digital dynamic where one can play alone with, others in the kind of space of, yeah, technology?
yeah, I think that's an important aspect of at least how I think about language and digitality and memory. Um, I think it kind of complicates this notion of isolation conceptually as well. And I think the way that the game works with other people's writing, this kind of like archival community, is for me an extension of this, of a realization that at least with a certain kind of orientation, you're always surrounded. You're always kind of in dialogue, working with a community that is either not yet or not here, you know, like either something that came before or something that's yet to come. This is maybe like the speculative dimension of what I guess what the digital offers, but I think in the same way, I think in a way that Russell speaks and works so great, like beautifully in, I'm really interested in the ways that a lot of digital logics have precursors. These are not
Mm,
unfamiliar ideas. Um, the idea that when you're alone, you're communing with those who are not visible is a kind of commonplace understanding, you know?
mm,
And I think with digital tools, that thing that maybe many of us find like normal but invisible can be materialized. And at least that's a way to talk about what's happening um, in digital interactions.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think there's also something of that reminds me of Khadija Queen published earlier this year a book called Radical Poetics. And one of the aims of the book is to bring the kind of analytic work of poetics into the everyday. And one of my challenges to that is also that it's really in relation to the everyday because there already is an analytic dimension that exists in the everyday, but where these artworks are positioning themselves outside of the white cube of the gallery, for example, Russel, let's come back to you. What becomes important about being able to think about your work within the digital space and considering the kind of, I'd say, resistance work that it's also engaged in?
So earlier on, when Nolan spoke of Mapungubwe as a system or multiple systems, and the question you had asked earlier on that I kind of asked to return to. So to produce knowledge in English is to fortify and expand the language itself, right? And there's a favor that we do to the English. I think to do the same for local languages, not just isiZulu, local languages, is to expand it, is to extend it in the same way that we do to in English. And so if say you have to understand the field of chemistry, just using that as an example, or engineering, perhaps, there's a sensibility that is, there's one would need to understand the English before you engage with the field of engineering. Like you have to understand English as a system, English language as a system, for example, before you even arrive at the question or at the study or the field of engineering. And in the same way, to do this using isiZulu requires someone to understand the system that is isiZulu as a language before you can engage with the thing that is being expressed. And so when you ask about this kind of the need to reclaim and the need and the importance of producing works in isiZulu, these are one of the objectives that one tries to do, which is to call people closer to understand this language as a system before you engage with what it is trying to express, you know. Um, and then I lost your last question that you just asked right now. So can you please
Yeah,
repeat?
I can repeat happily.
Yeah.
And I will now open to questions from our guests as well. Yes. So the question that I was asking is really now then relative to the digital space
Mm,
and the kind of interaction and the kind of flow that
mm,
actually happens between the everyday and the digital differently to works that exist within a gallery space and that kind of cube that pulls
uh,
itself outside of the everyday.
sure.
Yes,
Mm,
how do you think about your work as it exists within the digital space relative to the everyday?
mm, yeah. And in my view, to think of the everyday is to think about people who aren't particularly engage, say, in like very, very niche fields of, say, science fiction and like technopolitics and technopoetics. And so the production of the glossary, for example, is utilizing everyday speech, everyday vocabulary to talk about themes, concepts, and ideas that are otherwise locked within niche circles, or
Mm,
specialist circles. And so for this project, that question is through the use of isiZulu. The fact that you can play the film to a person who understands isiZulu, and you don't need to kind of geek out about digital space, cloud culture, etc., etc. Like people just get it. However, they enter it through a cosmology of Umzulu, not through the terms of science fiction and say Silicon Valley esque constructions of digital, you know? And I think to offer those modest gestures, do something in terms of personalizing this knowledge, which is otherwise quite removed and alien to the everyday experience of Black folk, Amazulu in this case.
Super. And so we'll hold it there as we let our guests ask their questions. Please do pop your question into the question and answer box. There already are 3 questions there that I will read out to our wonderful guests. And I'm really grateful for your engagement, Nolan and Russel. I think that where we have ended now in terms of thinking about the interaction between the digital and the everyday, as well as thinking about language and the different kinds of ways that it works through particular existing languages, but also through fragments that blur gender and do all kinds of interesting generative work. It's quite an exciting place for further thinking. So in our question and answer box, Nkandla Michael Dlamini asks, I think this is for you, Russel, can the Zata Institute expand into IRL or enroll other Nguni digital mystics? And Ntantla says, I am recently in the process of the project development phase of a work that is in French, Trésor des Peuples Reimagined, an AI or XR film for Cinematheque Afrique Archives Vivantes, and I'm currently struggling with the economics of radical Black digital innovation. I need information or access to various partners sharing the vision for African immersive storytelling. Russel, Nolan. Russel, you can unmute and see if you can answer part of that. The first part, I think, is also around, can the Data Institute expand into IRL or enroll other Nguni digital mystics?
Absolutely critical for data to be in conversation with other Nguni and beyond mystics. And I think it does see itself in the everyday, in the sense that the knowledge from which we are drawing is knowledge that has been accumulated over centuries in the everyday, you know? And so absolutely, I don't think the work sees itself outside of that. And one way to test this is to put the work in front of people who exist or live around where the work is drawing from. And if there's a level of resonance, then the job is done. And so we can test for that, you know. The same can be said about Ifede Mnyama. You know, you can take it to several parts of KZN and people can enter and access the film. Yeah. And so this, for me, is one way of thinking about these works in the everyday or as part of the everyday.
And by being able to enter and access the film, it means that people are more readily able to understand our capacity to enter and access digital technologies, which is also quite exciting. Glantla continues to ask, digital registers of WhatsApp and Blackness and digitalities is under archived and is highly important. The metamorphosis of Black modes of existence, such as local gossip in digital registers, such as WhatsApp, is an example of production of digital artifacts or unmined data. Yes. Would you like to respond to that, Nolan? I think you did bring up these kind of banal social interactions that happen on the digital scape as well.
Yeah, I think they're extremely important and should be archived. And unfortunately, like we're probably not consciously archiving them as like a cultural as a cultural resource, but they're probably being mined for data by Meta and other like big companies, you know. But I think, yeah, thinking about these kinds of archives and this kind of data it's important to think about them as cultural resources, as like a social commons, and not only as like an economic or a computational resource, which is kind of like where this AI conversation seems to be stuck. But I think like every time I see my mother's WhatsApp, my mind is blown, you know? There's like a whole universe. Um, yeah, like anyway, that's what I have to say.
Yes, yeah. And I think you're also touching on something that Russell is doing as part of this kind of work of knowledge production is also contributing to the artificial intelligence networks that are trying to gather information about how Africans speak about digital technologies. And I would be interested in seeing how this glossary, for example, begins to contribute to people being able to ask ChatGPT questions related to spiritual matters that cross over with digital languages and be able to produce really interesting answers from those things. Renzo Filinich asks or begins by saying many thanks to the speakers for their reflections. I would like to open the following reflection or provocation, followed by these questions about the technological and not only digital from a local perspective. Renzo continues to say, the attempt to produce a discourse on technology and a concept of technology appropriate to its functioning and potential that contributes or that incorporates its singular or local character is a major aesthetic philosophical problem. This is not only because of the neglect that has resulted from the current and indiscriminate use of a discourse in which the concept of technology operates as a kind of universal constant. This is not only because the acultural, ahistorical, and apolitical conceptualization of technology, where technology is alien to the living and the human as a thing to be used, is a neglect of technology. This is also because a local concept better responds to the functioning and production that technology produces. So in this sense, Renzo is asking the following questions. How can we produce a discourse on technology that incorporates its local character? I'm going to ask you, Russell, to speak to that. How can we produce a discourse on technology that incorporates its local character? And Nolan, if you can speak to what aesthetic and philosophical practices must be implemented to achieve this, what concepts inherited from tradition must be destroyed? And then we'll come back to with which ones could it or could it not be articulated, what notion of the local or the singular, what concepts of nature, culture, the body, etc. Russell, if you can speak to how can we produce a discourse on technology that incorporates its local character?
Yeah. So, the as one engaged with science fiction and you get to learn about the post-human and the cyborg and so on and so forth, it took me back to stories that my grandmother used to tell me about figures that she encountered or stories that she had heard of figures from the area that she was raised in. And one of them is Umungu. Umungu is said to be this kind of entity that is comprised of electric charge and spirit matter. And so the protagonist in the film is this entity, you know? So different people have different interpretations of what the protagonist is, you know? And in my way, this is a kind of, you are speaking to a local character, so to speak. Now, Umungu is one of many such figures in this world of Nguni cosmology, or at least in the Nguni cosmology. And I think the question to ask behind this character is, what kind of technical knowledge and understanding do the people who make this character need to have in order for them to craft it, right? In other words, how does a transcendentalist know how to manipulate and alter someone's subconscious to a point where they transcend the state or the human form or the human consciousness, let's say, and still retain the human form? And this figure can be deployed by its crafter. One is not necessarily interested in the technical aspects of this. I think to use that as a thought experiment, and one would need to draw and work from these knowledges in order to understand how technology operates in this localized context, using local characters to answer that question. And one can I think can successfully depart from the metrics of science fiction to answer this question. We can rely on something much more localized in this case. That's one way that I can answer this question.
Yeah.
And I will not always have the answers for these questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Russel. Nolan, could you come back to the question of what aesthetic and philosophical practices must be implemented to achieve this discourse on technology that incorporates local character?
Well, I'm going to answer this. I mean, I can't answer this question, but I'm going to answer this question as if what Russell has answered is the program that we are pursuing. And I think that I mean, I really don't know what aesthetic and philosophical programs need to be implemented, but I do know that the main issue with regard to tools is access. And access is a distribution problem. I think what Russell is proposing is a means of redistribution, that to create a language which allows people to kind of grasp and appropriate these tools, to understand them intuitively or within a kind of cosmology, is part of the necessary work of redistributing access to these tools. I think the other problem with tools is the assumption of purpose. Like, we assume that we know what tools are for because that's what they've been used for. But I think the history of all liberation practices is the history of misusing tools or appropriating the tools of your enemies or your oppressor in order to do something that they never imagined, which is to be basic, like to free yourself, And so for me, this entire question, I try to think about precisely through those people that Russell calls geeks, the niche. Because what I think this notion of the geek is a highly racialized and gendered construction that is extremely exclusionary, even of its own reality. Like the idea, the image of the geek doesn't account for the people who are genuinely actually interested in technology. And there are enough Black women, young Black men, Africans, queer people who are knee deep in all of this stuff, even without the language to translate it fully to their own cosmological context. And so for me, this meeting of Russell and the geeks is kind of the redistribution of energies that we need. And that's all I got to say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We don't have any further questions in our Q&A box. So I'd like to wrap up by asking you one last point of reflection. And I want to also just plug really our first Black Box discussion, which was with Tembeka Senguba and Puleng Munkale, which really did speak to this idea of being able to access digital vocabulary without necessarily having the school for it, and also having to struggle to learn that vocabulary without having that kind of access as well. But also how it spoke to the cosmological paradigms and the ways that people understand the use of their technologies in their everyday, and how those are applicable to this space, which is rendered alien to us, but which really does not need to be. So I'd like to ask you both to reflect on this question of aesthetics, and the philosophical aspect of it, which Renzo brought up for us, because I think it really touches on the title of this panel, which is Tech Futures and Poetics in Black Digital Arts. And so I'd like to ask you both to reflect on the connection of aesthetics to the discourses of language, literature, analysis, etc., to knowledge production. So aesthetics and its connection to knowledge production, and why it becomes important to consider the kinds of aesthetics that you are rendering your digital work through. How does that work and its rendering connect its aesthetics to knowledge production, which is a very important site of power? Nolan, shoot while
I'll,
Russell
I'll,
contemplates.
I'll start because I saw Russell and I felt that it's an it's another impossible question. But I think, I mean,
Yes.
for me, this the splitting of aesthetics from knowledge is a bit of an unrealistic framework to start with. I think all the work that Russell is doing is aesthetic in nature, but the aesthetic the is a necessary part of the knowledge, you know? And I think what we give up by imagining that we can do a clean English academic essay about our problems is precisely the thing that we're trying to overcome. Like the we're looking for the tools to be able to render our problems in a meaningful way in order to overcome them, you know? And for
Mm,
aesthetics and information are uh, just the same thing, really.
yeah, yeah.
Um, and I guess my work is, I would say, like fundamentally quite boring, because I'm interested in the structure. So the and the structure that emerges is a reflection of the tools that I'm using, but also the structure, I think, is related to the poetics that those tools offer. That
Mm,
even within the kind of structure of an essay, this idea of the essay game,
mm.
there is a way to uh, rearrange this so it can do the work that we want to do. And this rearrangement is a kind of like ornamental practice, you know, it's about turning things around. And I guess that's where I'm going to leave that.
Perfect, thank you. And Russell, I'm going to ask you to also think about Nolan's work, and then your work in reflecting about this idea of what connection are your aesthetics making to knowledge production, and how is this connection between aesthetics and knowledge production actually working to, yes, to do something within, yeah, the
Yeah.
systems of power.
Yeah, so I think there's something about what we are trying to bring visuality to. So these kind of long histories and long stories that have for a long time been neglected. And I think if we are trying to render those visible in say visual form, when I say visible in that very practical way, one has to ask whose registers are we using to make that claim, and do they resonate? So I think there's something about resonance as well when it comes to aesthetics, and from which we arrive at affect, and I try as much as possible to respond to one's immediate surrounds, to utilize the objects, to utilize the terms, to utilize the discrepancies of the everyday, and kind of place certain things in proximity, or maybe build distance between things in order for them to produce new meanings, However, at every point, or at least all the time, the fragments of that system should be recognizable, to those to whom one is trying to speak or respond to or invite to a conversation or inquiry. This is the best way I can attempt to answer your question.
Thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. Thank you both so much. I'm going to read our chat box as we say thank you and goodbye to everyone in attendance today. We have many a thank you. Thank you from Renzo. Thank you very much. Lee Walters, fantastic work. Obakeng, both Russell and Nolan produced excellent thought-provoking presentations. Thank you. Nosipo, thank you so much, Russell and Nolan, and Nondumiso, rich conversation and delightful provocations. Runette, incredible, thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. I would read all of them, but there's many. So we receive that thanks and we return it right back to you. Thank you for being with us. And again, to our guests, a very profound thank you for beginning a conversation that I could honestly have for another 4 or 5 hours, just from what has already come up. So I appreciate your effort, your work. I appreciate your spirit and your generosity in being with us today. Have an absolutely wonderful time, whatever time frame you are in, everybody. Thank you and goodbye.